Hail and well met, friends, and welcome to this extremely belated video. Why belated, you may well ask? Well, because I first devised this recipe back in December of 2022 when I was visiting my family back in Canada. Picture, if you will, a perfect Canadian white Christmas season with snow gently falling through the air and settling in twinkling mounds on tree branches and rooftops, and then turn that up to 11 and imagine the worst possible snowstorm you ever did see. No, seriously, the airport's shut down basically the day after we got there. Fun stuff! Anyway, it meant that when it came time to do some holiday baking, I just kind of had to brainstorm based on what ingredients were already in my dear mother's kitchen. And she happened to have some brown sugar and dates and a couple of spices, so the sticky toffee pudding cookie was born. And everybody seemed to like them so much that when I got back home, I put the recipe through multiple drafts and redrafts until it was exactly as I felt a sticky toffee pudding cookie should be. Anyway, I eventually hit on their final form, and I am not exaggerating when I call them glorious. For this recipe, you will need butter, plain flour, dark rye flour, bicarb, that's baking soda to my North American friends, salt, brown sugar, white sugar, an egg, vanilla, dates, and optionally, a little cinnamon and nutmeg, if you're feeling spicy. This is another one of those recipes that is super friendly for an impulsive baker or a goblin with ADHD like me who will forget to take the butter out well in advance of making a recipe, or somebody with a naturally cold kitchen who is just going to keep their butter block at an unspreadably hard texture no matter how long it sits out for. Because we're not softening the butter, we're going to melt it. And we're not just going to melt it, we're going to brown it. This adds a really nice depth to the overall flavor of the cookie, which in turn amplifies the toffiness of the whole situation. And the good news is that all you really need to do to brown butter is to put it on the hob in a small saucepan over a low flame and just kind of look at it. And if you're worried you'll get bored and let something distract you, don't worry, because it moves through the stages of buttery melthood at a fast enough clip that, to be honest, it holds even my fickle attention. Once the butter's melted, keep going. Pretty quickly it'll start to foam and sputter and make all kinds of amazing noise. This is good. Keep going. You can give it a little stir if you want to, which will make the most satisfying sounds. And eventually the sounds will simmer back down and you'll start to notice little flecks of brown floating around on the bottom of the liquid. Also good. Let this continue for a few moments until you've got a lovely deep liquid with lots of those lovely little brown bits at the bottom. Those little bits are the milk solids in the butter that you've caramelized, and they are flavor. Once your butter is there, just pop it to one side and let the temperature come back down to a gentle warm, and meanwhile we'll crack on with the dry ingredients. Into a mixing bowl, we are combining both of our flours, salt, bicarb, and spices if you're using them, and giving them a little mix to combine. Ta-da! I've found that the easiest way to chop up something like dates is to use a pair of kitchen scissors. And it really doesn't matter in this recipe if they're all the same size or not, so just try your best. I realized belatedly that it is also a really, really, really good pro tip to give your kitchen scissors just a little wipe with a paper towel that's soaked with just a tiny amount of oil to keep the dates from sticking to it. But of course, had I done that in the first place, of course not. What do you think I am, a person who remembers to do things? Now to the butter that's been patiently waiting to one side. Let's add our sugars and give it a really good stir. Then let's add our eggs and vanilla and tip in the dry ingredients and give everything a nice folding in. Then we'll fold in the dates, stirring and smushing until they're well distributed and there are no little dry bits of flour remaining. Now the dough is just going to go for a nice nap in the fridge for about 30 minutes, just to allow the flour to hydrate and to allow the butter to re-solidify a bit before it's ready to bake. And now that it's time for our dough to rest, we've got just enough time for a segment I'm still calling our Flag Means Facts. And Anyway, I went into this video thinking I'd probably have a fairly straightforward story to tell about the recipe that inspired the recipe that we're making today, and you can see the runtime of this video, right? Here we are!
I'm your captain, and I demand respect.
Oh boy.
Please?
Sticky toffee pudding. A quintessentially British dessert, right? Its very name evokes that feeling of cozy British whimsy that North American people just lap right up with lashings of warm custard like spotted dick and Kendal mint cake. Like, whenever I used to see these on a restaurant menu back in Canada, people were like, ooh, sticky toffee pudding. Oh gosh, that's British. Oh, it's so cozy. You have to get sticky toffee pudding. It's so good. And I'm like, hell yeah, it's gorgeous. That's why I made you a cookie about it. You're probably wondering why I mentioned up top that this video was absolutely months in the making. And sure, it took a while to perfect the recipe, and I was making other videos in the meantime while I was doing that, and in fairness, I didn't properly sit down to write the script for this video until like the summer of this year, when I wanted to do a little bit of research into the history of where and when the sticky toffee pudding entered the canon of British treats, for the sake of inserting a little anecdote here, and here's what I found. My first port of call was Wikipedia, which has a nice short blurb on the subject, which begins with, and I quote, "The origins of sticky toffee pudding are disputed." Oh, good! I definitely didn't want to do a nice, fairly straightforward video that would be easy to research. Instead, we have a handful of claims with varying levels of evidence, a whole bunch of unverifiable and sometimes contradictory information from mostly recipe blogs and Facebook from the looks of it, and about as close as we can get to an eyewitness testament from, like, a guy. Well, I guess let's dive into the sticky world of the... Why am I doing this to myself? It's a hot cake with sauce. Like, literally, who cares? So, as far as I've been able to glean from the many sources I've attempted to consult for this clusterfuck of Our Flag Means Facts segment, there are three major possible origin stories for the sticky toffee pudding that take us to three different places in three different times. One puts us in East Scotland, just north of Aberdeen, sometime in the 1960s or 1970s maybe. Another takes us to the Lake District in the mid-1970s, and yet another casts us all the way back to 1907 in the East Riding of Yorkshire. The Udney Arms in Newburgh, Aberdeenshire, is a lovely looking place from what I've seen online, and its recipe for sticky toffee pudding is pretty widely circulated as well. As for its claim, the Udney Arms' website makes no mention of this, though they do still have sticky toffee pudding on the menu, and quite right too, it looks delicious. The most concrete information I found to back this claim comes from a 2015 article from the Press and Journal about the closure and subsequent sale of the hotel. It has since reopened, and honestly, it looks really good. The article concludes with the statement, and I quote, "The hotel is famed for its sticky toffee pudding, claimed to have been invented by Nancy Stott, who started working at the hotel around 40 years ago. In her time at the Udney Arms, it is estimated she will have made more than 500,000 of her famous desserts," which is a wild number of puddings. I mean, challenge accepted, but like, since the article was published in 2015, if that's correct, and we're looking at about 40 years before then, we're looking at about 1975. Though I've seen the year 1967 thrown around in a lot of other sources as well. I have tried so hard to come up with any other information about Nancy Stott and her pudding smithery, and I've basically turned up bupkis apart from that one article I've already cited. Not for lack of trying. Very much not for lack of trying. So I don't know where they learned this, but I also have no reason to think that anybody's just maliciously making stuff up either. I feel like what I'm running into a lot here is that despite its vast and sprawling breadth, there's actually a lot of information that's not easily accessible on the internet. And sometimes some of the things that used to be there aren't there anymore. Like, I've found articles that link to the Udny Arms' website, but it links to what is now a dead page because the ownership changed hands and the pub was just closed for a while. And when it reopened, they quite rightly revamped the website to have current and accurate information on it. But that means that if there was anything on there at any point that maybe said something about Nancy and her sticky toffee puddings, it's kind of lost. So what we're left with is sourceless tidbits of maybe information passed to us via these bizarre games of telephone, without ever knowing where a statement started or maybe what the original version of it looked like. Things get embellished in retellings, and the original versions of these stories are lost to time because ultimately, I don't think most people view this kind of history as all that important. And maybe I am just a hyperfixated weirdo who needs easier hobbies. Anyway, let's take a jolly jaunt across the landmass to the beautiful Lake District, where the charismatic Francis Colson opened the Sharrow Bay Hotel and, according to a bunch of recipe blogs, started serving sticky toffee pudding in around 1960. Well, that predates the Udny Arms' claim to fame by a good few years, and Colson's name appears a lot in connection with the dessert. But I need to pop a pin in that for just a wee moment, because hold on, Francis. Did you know that there is another very widely circulated origin story for the STP that places it way back in 1907? That's right, legend also has it that the sticky toffee pudding was invented by the landlady of the Gate Inn in Millington, East Riding of Yorkshire, way back when everyone was still in old-timey, soft-focus black and white, with ladies with big poofy hairdos and gentlemen still went out with hats on. Case closed. Except an article was published by Love Food in 2011 in which the author Jassy Davis spoke to Stuart Stevenson, who was the landlord of the Gate Inn at the time, who is quoted as saying, "We still serve sticky toffee pudding here, but don't know the origins. Many people drop in to try it, and we don't know whether there's a bogus story linking us to the pudding on the web. And frankly, I think if the landlord is willing to disavow ownership of the venerable pudding, I feel like we can probably take him at his word." But wait! What's that off in the distance? Why, it's another claimant for the sticky toffee crown! That's right, because it turns out that the sticky toffee pudding was invented in the early 15th century by Stickington Toffeesworth, a member of minor nobility from the West Riding of East Grimbleshire who loved eating sticky dates so much that he started losing his teeth aged only 21. Because of this, he needed a softer delivery system for his sweet treats, and the sticky toffee pudding was born. Case closed. Believe it or not, that statement isn't true at all. In fact, I made it up right now. Turns out you can just say whatever you want on the internet. It's a factual free-for-all, friends. Remember how I popped that pin in earlier about how widespread the belief is that it was Francis Colson's hotel, the Sharrow Bay in the Lake District, that was the birthplace of the sticky toffee pudding? Perhaps the best and most oft-quoted origin story of them all. Oh, wait a minute. He's actually gone on record admitting he didn't invent it either, so we should probably stop giving him sole credit for it. The food writer Simon Hopkinson wrote in a 2008 Guardian article that he asked Francis Colson directly about the sticky toffee pudding's provenance, as they happened to be dining together. And Hopkinson had first encountered the recipe in the 1971 Good Food Guide Dinner Party Cookbook, which attributed the recipe to a Mrs. Martin of the Old Rectory Hotel in Claughton, Lancashire. "Well, you know, there was this sweet woman in Lancashire," Francis explained. "And such a lovely cook. Marvellous puddings. And, well, yes, there might have been a recipe published somewhere, but mine is much better now, and we call our updated version the Icky Sticky Toffee Sponge, to avoid any confusion." Okay, I guess that does kind of clear it up. Hopkinson goes on to say that he later spoke to Mrs. Martin's son Pierce, who recalls that the recipe was, in fact, given to her by a Canadian friend. Well, There you go, I guess. If there's one thing I noticed in all of my research for this disgusting mess of a fun fact segment, it's that things that might have been true get passed around from recipe blog to recipe blog and Facebook post to Facebook post with little tweaks here and there like a weird game of telephone until, oh, I don't know, it might be, but probably not. So, like, was it some friends who just happened to be visiting from Canada that brought an inspirational recipe to Mrs. Martin? Or was it a couple of Canadian Air Force officers stationed in England who happened to be staying there, as I've also seen quoted a few times? Materially makes no difference to the end result, but semantically it is a difference, and therefore it is kind of a different story. Every time these little details get tweaked or misprinted on someone's blog or article or wherever, we drift a little further from history and a little closer to legend has it. And sometimes legend has it really is all you have. But tweaking the facts of history into what you think makes a more interesting story does a disservice to history and makes unpaid researchers like me really, really, really tired. But at least we finally dug to the sticky layer of truth at the bottom of the pudding basin of history. Case closed. But wait! Here's where it gets even more complicated! See, but here's the thing. I'm from Canada, and while our regional culinary inventions are as diverse as our vast land, if sticky toffee pudding as such was something I felt I could confidently lay claim to on behalf of the people of my land of birth, I surely would. But as far as any Canadians I've ever known are concerned, sticky toffee pudding was a fairly recent and very exciting import from Britain. Here's where I should tell you that we're flowing hard into the land of educated guesses and conjecture. Namely, we do have puddings in Canada. And I suppose it isn't outside the realm of possibility that one of these was adjusted and adapted from a Canadian recipe. I mean, there's the Newfoundland figgy duff, of course, but that's more of a traditional British-style steamed pudding in the first place, whereas the sticky toffee pudding is baked and starts with a much more fluffy, fluid cake-style batter, so I think we can discount this one from the outset. A more likely candidate, if this is the case, I think, might be something like the pudding chômeur, which is a Depression-era pudding from Quebec, which is a self-saucing pudding that's made by pouring a maple syrup or brown sugar sauce over a plain sponge and then baking in the oven. It's also super delicious. Oh my god, it's so good. Anyways. But the sponge is pretty light in color and it's oftentimes mapley, whereas the sticky toffee pudding is dark and deep and more wholesome in texture and also has dates in it. So perhaps they're cousins, but by no means the same. And if this is the case and many liberties were taken with the original recipe, then I guess we do have Mrs. Martin to thank for what we now know is the sticky toffee pudding. Or possibly just some Canadian maverick who invented this thing whose identity is lost to time and just they never published it. Who knows? Except, here's where it gets even more complicated. I'm so tired. I remembered that fellow Canadian YouTuber Glenn of Glenn and Friends has a series on his channel where he makes many and various recipes from the many and various old cookbooks. So I thought I might drop him a line and ask if he's ever encountered any clues as to this whole sticky toffee pudding mystery. Turns out I didn't have to. Glenn's made a sort of date loaf cake that he found in a bunch of Canadian community cookbooks dating to around the 1930s. The timelines match up, and given the ingredients of these loaf cakes, it looks like it could also be a parent of the sticky toffee pudding. I'll pop a link to Glenn's video in the description if you want to hear his thoughts on the matter. We love Glenn and his channel in this house, by the way. Hi, Glenn! And I can definitely see why this theory tracks as well. There's certainly a lot of ingredients in common, which suggests a through line there. But then on the other hand, it doesn't have the saucy, sticky situation that the pudding chômeur does. They both come out of around the same era, the right country, the right place, yada, yada, yada. So what if, and hear me out here, I know this is going to sound wild, but What if Mrs. Martin was given both of these recipes and said, hey, I wonder what would happen if these two recipes had a baby? And the sticky toffee pudding was born. We are so hard into legend has it that I'm just conjecturing out my butt here, but hey, it might be the best theory we have to go on. It involves some Canadians sharing a recipe with an English cook who mucked about with it until we got what looks like the sticky toffee pudding that appeared in a 1971 cookbook that I cannot afford a secondhand copy of, and oh biddle boy is it out of print. This is an unsatisfying conclusion. Moving on. The history of the specific recipe I'm making today, however, is a lot more traceable. It started last Christmas when we were visiting my family in Canada. My mother asked if I'd like to do some holiday baking, which, like, obviously I would. But the snow had been storming hard for days. The roads were impassable. There was no way we were going to be able to get out and pick up bits if we needed to. So I just had to deal with whatever happened to be in the kitchen at the time. Personally, I'm having the time of my life. It was highlighted to me that we had dates and some spices and brown sugar, and inspiration struck. The resulting cookie was lovely. It's gone through a few iterations since, and it is genuinely one of my favorite things to bake now. A quick Google search tells me I'm by no means the first person to make a sticky toffee pudding cookie. But the fact that I had the idea independently of any knowledge of recipes floating out there is, if nothing else, a reminder that, sometimes the same thing can and does get invented twice, especially if it's a good idea. Maybe it's possible, I guess, that some manner of a similar pudding was devised at two different establishments a few years apart, unbeknownst to each other. So maybe all of the origin stories of the sticky toffee pudding are true. I'm not here to give a definitive pronouncement on the matter because I simply can't. We have but fragments of anecdotes to learn from. Hey, so I think our dough is chilled for long enough. Let's get the oven preheating to 180 degrees C for a fan oven or 200 for a regular oven. I'm mounting scoops of about a teaspoon each onto a parchment-lined baking tray, giving them a reasonable amount of space as they will spread as they bake. I'm not super concerned about rolling these into perfect balls because they've got bits in them and they'll spread as they will in the oven anyways. And who needs their cookies to be an exact shape? I don't. They're all just going to be unceremoniously shoved into my mouth as soon as they're cooled enough to safely eat without burning myself. So, and now it's time to pop them into the oven. Bye-bye, dough. Have a fun time in the oven. They'll want to hang out in there for about 10 to 12 minutes or until they look done. Because of the amount of brown sugar and other dark things happening in the dough, you can't really look for golden brown in the same way that you would like a chocolate chip cookie or something like that. So really, you're just looking for the dough looks set and they look baked. If they're a little overdone, they'll be a little crispy, and that's fine. And if they're a little underdone, you can just put them back in for another minute, or you can just have really nice, soft, gooey cookies, which honestly, for a sticky toffee pudding, I think sounds kind of divine. And here's what they look like when they're done. Aren't they pretty? I can tell you they smell amazing and taste even better. Craggy and chewy and absolutely delicious. Here's some totally not staged footage of me eating one. Wow, I'm really enjoying myself. Good cookie. This channel has a pathetically low output, in part because I keep getting sucked into these histories that seem like they should be fairly straightforward. And within moments, I'm catapulted down a well of misinformation and uncited sources and conflicting anecdotes and things that are, despite my best efforts, ultimately lost to the sands of time. And maybe this is a failing on my part, letting myself be led down these hyperfixation-induced garden paths to try and uncover mysteries that are ultimately inconsequential in the grand scheme of things. But for the fact that actually that's not entirely true. I do think that there's value in being able to trace the history of everyday things, and while it wasn't my intention at the outset of this, given the degree to which so many of women's contributions to history are overshadowed by men, either by virtue of those men being louder or better known, or just because in general our culture has a historical track record of shuffling women off to one side and crediting their male peers instead. Or in the case of 2 videos in a row here, when women are acknowledged, they're not acknowledged very well. And that sucks. I would like, if I may, to speak directly to the 1970s for a moment and say, hey you! Stop crediting men for women's innovations. Also, maybe stop making salads that are encased in jelly. Like, it's just nasty. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this unexpected deep dive and genuinely good semi-related recipe. If you like these kind of shenanigans, feel free to subscribe. We upload... I want to say we're going to start uploading semi-regularly, but I don't want you to get your hopes up. But if you did like this video, please feel free to drop a like to let me know. And if you've got anything you'd like to share, feel free to sound off in the comments as well. You can follow me on the various social media that I'm on that are linked variously on this channel. I do have a Patreon where I post occasional artworks and bonus videos as well. Oh, and a cheeky discount to my shop where you can get things like these little guys. Oh, and a Twitch channel where I also make artwork and play cozy video games. I've gone on long enough that I can no longer form coherent sentences, so I'm going to stop talking now and just say thank you very much indeed for watching, and I do hope that you have a splendid